Okay, I think we're ready to go. So good afternoon, everyone. It's another exciting talk at Google. We're glad you could join us. Today we are hosting Bill Uri. He is the author of many of the definitive works in the field of negotiation, the co-author of Getting to Yes, Getting Past No. The current book is Getting to Yes with Yourself. And the idea behind it is to take the sort of personal and introspective look as a means towards, approaching the negotiation table. So in many ways, this is the prequel, the prelude to his other works, and it could even help foster the conditions for world peace. Bill is also the co-founder of the program on negotiation at Harvard University, and has a very distinguished international career on the negotiation circuit as well. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming him to Google. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here speaking at Google. I have a great debt to Google because I use Google every single day. It makes my life a lot easier, and some of my projects actually also benefit from Google in the form of AdWords. So it's just a huge pleasure to be here, and I really have enjoyed the campus. What I want to talk to you about is what I regard as perhaps the most important competence that we need in today's times, and that's the competence of getting to yes. Aside from coding, perhaps, getting to yes is a really important skill for reaching agreements, for building healthy relationships, for resolving disputes, and it is not always easy. I've had the privilege of having a kind of a front seat for the last 30 or 35 years on a revolution that's taking place around the world that accompanies the knowledge revolution, accompanies the information revolution, accompanies the internet. And that's a revolution in the way in which individuals such as ourselves, organizations such as yours, and societies make decisions. Because traditionally, a generation or more ago, maybe the preeminent process for making decisions was the people on the top of the pyramids of power. They give the orders, and the people on the bottom follow the orders. But nowadays, thanks to the knowledge revolution, those pyramids of power are increasingly flattening themselves into networks, organizations that resemble networks like Google, where the form of decision-making shifts from vertical to horizontal. And another name for horizontal decision-making is negotiation. And what I've also seen is that when I started in this area of negotiation, most people had a notion of negotiation as being kind of, who's going to win this? And that's shifted over time as the logic has shifted to one into which, can we both satisfy our basic needs? Can we both win, as it were? Can we achieve, a classic win-win solution? It's not always easy. Today, these days, conflict is a growth industry. And if you look around at the news, it seems like people are just as often getting to no as they are getting to yes. And so my question is, what stops us from getting to yes? So what I'd like to do, if I may just begin, is just to kind of draw you out a little bit about your own experiences as negotiators, because like it or not, we are all negotiators. If I were to define negotiation very simply and very broadly as back and forth communication, you're trying to reach some kind of agreement, and you may have some interests that you hold in common, like an ongoing relationship, and you have other interests which are in tension, like you would like to get more money for your products and services, they would like to give you less, or you've got the budget, you'd like a larger slice of that budget. In that broad sense of the term, who do you find yourself negotiating with in the course of your day, would you say? Just to kind of see what the variety of your situations are. Who do you negotiate with? Your kids. Okay, those are not always so easy to negotiate. So who else do you negotiate besides your kids? Significant others. Okay, so some of the tough negotiations start at home. Who else do you negotiate with? Your teammates, co-workers. Who else? Yeah. Yourself. Okay. Right. On the one hand, you want to push yourself. On the other side, there's a part of you that feels tired and exhausted. Okay, so there's this negotiation inside of ourselves. So if you were to just make a ballpark estimate of how much of your time you spend engaged, broadly speaking, in the act of back and forth communication, trying to reach agreement with your kids, your significant other, your colleagues, your coworkers, your bosses, clients, suppliers, yourself, what percentage of your time do you think you spend engaged in this process? You had to take a guess. What would you say?
Probably about half.
About half? Okay. How many would agree with that? It's about half. Okay. How many would say it's even more than half? Okay. So, whatever it is, it's a very, that's a huge chunk of our time. And we may not always think of it in the formal sense as negotiation, but in the broad sense of the term, this is a process we're engaged in from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night. So let me ask you a couple other questions here. If you were to think back over the last 10 years of your career as you've kind of risen up and you have more authority and so on, would you say the amount of time that you spend negotiating has stayed pretty much the same? Has it gone down over time, or has it gone up? How many up? How many would say it's gone up? Okay, that's the majority. So that's what I call this negotiation revolution. There's a kind of a negotiation revolution. I see it in every country I visit as the form of decision-making shift. Negotiation has become the preeminent form for making decisions, not just at work, but at home, in our communities, in politics, in the world. And the question is, how do we learn to do it better? And my question is what stops us from getting to yes? Let me ask you just for a moment, just to take any situation you'd like, just to have in mind as we talk about this subject of getting yes for the next hour. Take any situation that you'd like to focus on. Some negotiation you're involved in. Could be with your child, it could be with your significant other, it could be with a coworker. Just pick a situation, okay? Everyone pick a situation, something that's been maybe a little problematic for you. Some negotiation you're involved in, okay? Everyone got one? So then let me ask you if there are two kinds of negotiations. There are the external negotiations that are outside, let's say with customers, with suppliers, standardly what we talk about is negotiation. And then there are the negotiations inside, like inside the family or inside your work unit. How many of, just out of curiosity, have just selected an external negotiation? That was what came to mind when you were thinking about a problematic one. How about internal? Okay, a lot of internal. And if I ask you this question of, if you were to make a broad generalization, just from your own experience, which is more problematic for you? The external negotiations or the internal ones? Which ones tend to give you more trouble? How many would say it's external gives me more trouble? Okay? How many would say it's internal gives me more trouble? That's interesting. If you look around the room, it's like 90%. Now, obviously, both can be problematic. And in fact, a lot of external negotiations have an internal component. But so my question is this, when I'm thinking about, because my passion for the last 35 years has been helping people, organizations, societies get to yes, from family feuds to boardroom battles, from labor strikes to civil wars in different parts of the world. And the thing that's kind of struck me is that actually when I think about what makes negotiations very difficult, what I've gradually come to realize is that the negotiation with ourselves, what could be more internal than the negotiation with ourselves? Because it seems like we experience internal negotiations as more problematic, but perhaps the most problematic is the one with ourselves. And this is what I found is that perhaps our biggest opponent, the biggest obstacle to us getting what we want in life and in our negotiations is not what we often think it is. It's not just the other person across on the other side of the table. That person can be very difficult. Those people can be very difficult. And I've specialized in dealing with difficult people in difficult situations. But I find that however difficult that person is, the most difficult person I have to deal with at least, is right here. It's myself. We are, in some ways, our own biggest opponent. That's the person we look at in the mirror every morning. That's the person who's going to give us the most trouble. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who President Teddy Roosevelt, who once said, if you could give a kick in the pants to the person who will give you most trouble in life, you would not sit for a month. We are often our own worst enemies because we human beings, for one thing, we're reaction machines. We tend to react. We tend to react in ways that do not serve our long-term interests. And so my question is how do we turn that biggest opponent of ours into our biggest ally? That's what I think of as the process of getting to yes with yourself. How do you turn your own opponent, yourself as opponent, into an ally? It's not easy. And what I've found is that what we tend to do is it's almost as if we get in our own way. And it's almost as if we've been negotiating, and the way I've tended to focus in negotiation always on the other side of the table. And I realize that part of the problem is on this side of the table. And it's almost as if we've been negotiating with one arm tied behind our back, because we're negotiating just focus on the external, influencing the other person, when in fact our biggest opportunity is to start off by influencing this person right here. And so what I'd like to do with you for a moment is just, from that realization, I've kind of come to realize that getting to yes is an inside job. And so what I'd like to do is talk about how do we do that? How do we handle that first and perhaps most important negotiation that we ever engage in, the one that starts from within? What are some principles of how do you get to yes with yourself as the first step towards getting to yes with others? How do we do that inner homework? And I know here, I just had the pleasure of spending several hours with Meng, and I know you have these courses about searching inside yourself and doing that work of self-awareness and of attention training and so on. So this will be very congruent with that kind of work. So what I'd like to do is just review with you just a few principles, and then I'd like to leave time for some questions so we can go into any of your situations or any questions you might have about negotiation. But what I see is that I'm going to go over some principles that are the very same principles we might apply outwards, but to apply them inwards first. I think of them as the psychological antecedents to the process of getting to yes. So the first and maybe the foundation that I've been teaching for many years around negotiation is the ability to, I like to use the metaphor of going to the balcony. The balcony basically it's almost like you're negotiating up here on a stage. Part of your mind goes to a mental or an emotional balcony overlooking that stage, which is a place of perspective. It's a place of calm. It's a place of clarity. It's a place of self-control. It's a place where you can keep your eyes on the prize. Because so often we're reacting. We're often reacting out of fear. We're reacting out of anger. And as the old saying goes, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And sometimes we get brought into a process of either attacking the other side sometimes out of anger, or accommodating, giving in to the other side out of fear, or simply avoiding conflict altogether. How many of you, just out of curiosity, if I ever ask you, if you had I sometimes think of this as the 3 A's, attack, accommodate, and avoid. How many of you, if you said, I have a tendency to accommodate, how many would say you have a tendency to accommodate? I would say you have a tendency to attack more when you're in a conflict. How many would say you have a tendency to avoid? Okay, so, we often, it's almost like, and sometimes we use a combination of all of them. We may accommodate for a long time, and then we kind of, with our child, and then we suddenly lose it. And when you've been to that movie, and then we attack. And then we go back to avoiding, and it's just, the question is there a better way? And I think there is a better way of getting to yes, which is actually engaging the differences in a constructive way. But in order to do that, it requires us to go to the balcony. And it's hard to go to the balcony these days, and particularly, today with everything, all our technology and cell phones and texts and tweets and everything that's going on, It's so easy to get reactive. It's almost, I mean, for example, you're there at your computer and you get an email that you suddenly felt, wait a minute, they didn't consult me on that decision, and you kind of feel ticked off and irritated. So it's just very natural to compose a reply. You get that instant satisfaction of hitting the reply button, but you don't just hit the reply button, you hit the reply all button. And then it goes out to the entire organization, and you start to see conflicts start to escalate. There is a button on that screen that is often rarely used that I think of as the balcony button, and it says save as draft. That's the one where you get it out of your system, you save it as a draft, then everyone has their favorite techniques for going to the balcony. Some people might, breathe or meditate. Some people might go for a walk in these lovely surroundings here, or go have a cup of coffee with a friend, or sleep on it. But you're going to come back after a few minutes or a few hours. You're going to look at that email, and you're going to ask yourself the important question, is this going to advance my interests? Is this really going to serve the needs of this situation? And most likely you're going to hit the delete button, and then you're going to pick up the phone, call the person, get together with them, or however, to try to resolve the situation. Because email, as it turns out, while it's a great way to convey information, is not such a great way to deal with anything that's emotionally delicate. So, those are all ways of going to the balcony. So but the question is, a lot of people find that they fall off the balcony. We fall off the balcony. It's just natural. So the question is, how can we stay on the balcony? And so this brings to the next principle, which is one of the key principles in negotiation. I mean, if people ask me, what's the most important skill that a negotiator needs to have? There are a lot of skills that we need to have, but if I had to pick one, usually I pick this one. It's the ability to put yourself in the other side's shoes. In other words, the ability to try and understand what your coworker really wants, or what your child wants, or what your significant other wants. It's to listen to them. Because after all, negotiation is an exercise in influence. You're trying to change someone's mind. How can we possibly change their mind if we don't know where their mind is? So putting yourself in their shoes is key. But what I've discovered in teaching this over many, many years is that it's not easy for people to put themselves in the other side's shoes. It's not easy for us to listen to others, because there's so much going on for us in our own minds already that there's no mental or emotional space for us to be able to invite in the other person's concerns. So the biggest block to us being able to put ourselves in the other side's shoes, which is key if you're dealing with customers or clients or anything like that, is absolutely key. But the biggest block is us. And so what I found paradoxically is that there's a psychological antecedent to putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, and that's to put ourselves in our own shoes first. In other words, not just to listen to them, but before we can listen to them properly, we need to listen to ourselves. We need to be able to see ourselves from the balcony. We need to be able to practice the skills of self-observation and watch what happens. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who centuries ago said, observe all people, yourself most of all. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little story, just if I may, from my own experience of when I began to really focus on this whole issue of how do I negotiate with myself. I was involved some years ago as a mediator in a conflict in Venezuela. I had been asked by President Carter to be a third party in between the government of Venezuela, the president, whose name was Hugo Chavez, some of you may remember him, and the political opposition. And it was a time when there were about 1 million people on the streets of Caracas, the capital city, demanding the resignation of the president, and 1 million people on the streets supporting him, and there was some violence, and people were genuinely afraid it might lead to a civil war. Anyway, at one point, I had a number of meetings with President Chavez, but one of them, he was a kind of complex and somewhat volatile individual, but one of them, we had a meeting with my friend Francisco, colleague Francisco, set at 9 o'clock. He liked to meet at night in the presidential palace, and we waited patiently there, and finally midnight came, and we were ushered in to see the president. instead of finding him alone at midnight, we found his entire cabinet arrayed behind him. And he said, "So, Bill," he said, "have a seat here. Now, tell me, what do you think of the situation here? What's your impression?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, I've been talking to some of your government ministers here and some of the opposition, and it seems to me you're making some progress." As soon as he heard the word progress, he got triggered. He said, "What do you mean progress? Are you blind? You're not seeing the dirty tricks those traitors in the opposition are up to?" And he proceeded to get furious, leaned in very close to my face, and started to yell for approximately 30 minutes. Now, in front of his entire cabinet. Now, if you put yourself in my shoes, I was kind of going, wait a minute, I'm not blind. You're trying to defend yourself, thinking about that. But then, thankfully, I was able to go to the balcony for a moment and ask myself the important question, is it really going to advance my cause, the cause of peace, for me to get into an argument with the president of Venezuela? So I thought the better of it. I bit my tongue and I just listened to him. And sure enough, he was a man who could go on for 8 hours, give a speech, no problem. If I had interrupted him and tried to argue with him, I'm sure, could have gone way off the tracks. And I was thinking in myself, okay, 2 years of work here in Venezuela all down the drain. You get reactive in the situation like that when someone is shouting at you like that. And, but somehow I was able to go to the balcony, suspend my normal reaction, and I saw after 30 minutes, by me not reacting, I saw his shoulders kind of sink a little bit, and in a weary tone of voice, he said to me finally, "So, Bill, what should I do?" Well, that is the sound of a human mind opening. Because, when you try to deal with someone who's in an angry state of mind, they're not going to listen to reason. But at some point, he finally was saying, okay, so what should I do? He's willing to open. So I said, Mr. President, I think the entire country of Venezuela needs to go to the balcony. It's almost Christmas time. Last Christmas, the festivities were canceled because of the conflict. Why not have a truce and give everyone a chance to enjoy the holidays with their families? And when we come back in January, maybe everyone will be in a better mood. And President Chavez said, "That's a great idea. I'm going to propose that in my next speech." His mood had completely shifted. And then he said to me, over Christmas, I'm going to travel around the country, and I'd like you to come with me and see the country. And then he thought for a moment. He said, "But wait a minute, you're neutral. Maybe it won't be so good for you to be seen always in my company." He said, "But that's no problem. I'll give you a disguise." Anyway, his mood had completely shifted. Now, why was that? Because I had been able to, in order for me to put myself in his shoes, I first had been able to put myself in my own shoes. Because when I was waiting there in those 3 hours that I was waiting for him, I took some time just to meditate or just to be quiet by myself, quiet my mind, listen, so that I was less reactive. And even when it was happening then, from a balcony perspective, I could just watch, I could observe my thoughts, about, this is all going, all my work going down the drain. I could observe my emotions of being embarrassed. I could observe my physical sensations. And instead of reacting to them, I could simply let them pass so that I could then focus on President Chavez. So again, it's just a lesson to me about how important it is to put yourself in your own shoes before you try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. How important it is to listen to yourself before you listen to others. And of course, in doing that, what you find is you can uncover what are your deepest needs in this situation. What do you really want? Now, that may seem very obvious to us, but I can't tell you how many times I've been involved in situations, whether it's family or work or politics, where people don't know what they really want. We think we know what we want, but we haven't really gone deep enough. And if I may, I'll just give you just another example, just to kind of illustrate that from a business context. About 1.5 years ago, I was contacted by a business leader that I knew down in Brazil who wanted my help in helping her father, who was one of Brazil's leading businessmen. He had founded Brazil's largest retailer, had 150,000 employees, and he was involved in a gigantic conflict with his business partner, who was French. And they'd been fighting each other in the courts for 2.5 years. It was all over the papers. The media called it perhaps the largest boardroom cross-continental showdown in recent history. And it was affecting everyone. It was not just affecting the parties, but their families, the 150,000 employees of the company that had divided loyalties and so on. And she asked me if I could help. I didn't know if I could help, but I sat down. I agreed to sit down with her father, and I sat down with him at his home. And he told me the story. And I said, it seemed to me he was unclear. Did he want to fight? Or did he really want to settle this? And I think he was torn inside himself, like many of us. We're torn. What exactly do we want most? Because he was going to be chairman of the board for another 8 years. He was already 76 until he was 84. So I asked him, I said, Abilio, tell me, what do you want here? What do you really want? How can I help you? I mean, what is it you really want? And he said, well, I want my stock at a certain price. I want the elimination of the non-compete clause. I want some real estate. He gave me a list. But as I listened to it, I said, no, but Abilio, you're a man who seems to have everything. You've got everything you possibly want. You know, you're a billionaire. I mean, what do you really want here? And he finally said, after I probed for a while, he finally said, freedom. That's what I want. I want my freedom. And then that's when I was hearing the human being. And then I asked him, what do you want the freedom for? And he said, well, I want freedom to spend time with my family here, which is the most important thing in my life. And I also want freedom to pursue the business deals that I've always loved pursuing. So once we were clear about what his underlying needs were, then the negotiation with the other side became a lot easier. And even though it had gone on for 2.5 years, negotiations had broken down, it took my colleagues and I just 4 short days from the time we had the first meeting to the time we had both men sitting side by side, signing an agreement, shaking hands, press conference, joint press statement, wishing each other well, making a joint presentation to the executives of the company and to the employees of the company explaining it, and moving on with their lives. And that just, again, underscored for me how important it is to be able to uncover your needs. So in your own situation, if you think about it for a moment, it's just always useful to ask, you know, what do I most want or need here? Behind what I think I need, behind the position, the concrete thing, what's the equivalent of freedom for you in that situation? What's truly important here? What's the real prize for you? You know, in the negotiation with your kid, what's really truly important here? What's the most important thing for you? It's, again, something that we may lose sight of when we get involved in a conflict. And where that leads you to is, then the question is, where's the power going to come from to meet your needs? Now, in negotiation, we have a concept that Roger Fisher and I could have called in Getting to Yes many years ago. We called it your BATNA. It's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to satisfy your interests if you cannot reach agreement? You know, what's your walkaway alternative? What are you going to do? It's just something. To have an alternative. If you're not going to. If you don't have this one client, is there another client? If you don't, just gives you a sense that I mean, to me, this is what the internet, this is what Google does, is it gives people alternatives. Suddenly, because in the old days, when they didn't have much information, you had to go just with one way. But now you can Google and you can find other ways of doing it. So to me, in some ways, you're the BATNA company. You help people, you give people BATNAs. Now, what I've found, though, interestingly, in teaching this is a lot of people, we don't naturally think of our BATNA. We just focus on just getting the agreement, not the alternative. And what's awful blocking us is, I find, is there's an inner psychological prerequisite to this, which is what you might call your inner BATNA, which is your commitment to take care of your own needs. If I go back to the story of my friend Abilio for a moment, in the retailer in Brazil, when he told me he wanted freedom, I asked him, okay, Abilio, who can give you the freedom you most want? Who can give you the freedom you most want? Is it only your arch enemy? Or to some extent, can you give yourself that own freedom? Well, once he understood that, oh yeah, he could give himself a little bit, then he said, okay, well, even without us reaching agreement with the other side, what could he do? He could pursue some business deals. He moved his office out of the company. He became chairman of another company. He spent time, took holiday with his family. Psychologically, that shifted the situation because he was no longer so psychologically dependent on the other side. Then it was much easier to reach agreement. And so the question, again, for us to ask ourselves is, who in the end is really responsible for meeting my needs in the situation? What can I do to meet my needs independently, perhaps, of the other side? And how can I take care of myself? What would that be for you? Which brings me then to, where does your satisfaction come from in negotiation or in life generally? Let me just actually ask you to do a quick, sometimes in negotiation we like to use little exercises. I'd like to just invite you to participate in a quick 30-second exercise, if you will. If you wouldn't mind, just totally voluntary here, but if you wouldn't mind turning to the person next to you and getting into arm wrestling position with them, as if you were going to arm wrestle. For those who want to demonstrate this, okay? Yes, okay, get into, yeah, as if you're going to arm wrestle, right? You can even support your elbows, right? So, okay, here we go. So, as in business, you want to maximize your score here. Let's say you get 1,000 points every time you get the other person's arm down, right? Okay? Get ready, get set, go. You get the other person's arm down. Right. Okay. So what I see here is there's a learning process, right? There's a learning process. And essentially there's a learning process where, it was like you two gentlemen there. You started off 0-0, right? It can't go anywhere. And that's often how we do it. And then suddenly, if you're super strong, maybe you get the other person's arm down once. But then it was like a light bulb went on and people said, wait a minute. I saw it here, if I get my arm down, that's 1,000 points for you, and 1,000 points for me, and 1,000 points for you, and 1,000 points for me, like a windshield wiper, and suddenly you're accumulating tens of thousands of points. Well, think about that. We often approach negotiation like an arm wrestle, right? Who's going to win this? But in fact, the greatest power we have may be the power to change the game, from an arm wrestle to a search for mutual gain here. And the question for me is, why is it so hard for us to do that? It's because there's a mindset. We often have a mindset in mind that basically holds that, this is like a dog-eat-dog world, and it's a hostile world, and, it's ranged against me, and somehow it's scarce. There's a mindset of scarcity, which is why, one of the greatest minds of the last century, Albert Einstein, once asked this question. He said, is the universe a friendly place? This is the first and most basic question all people must answer for themselves. Now, why would Einstein say that? Why would he ask that question? Because his reasoning was, in the wake of World War II and the advent of nuclear weapons, he reasoned that if we basically answer this question and say the universe is an unfriendly place, because after all, who knows, but if we decide to choose the universe as an unfriendly place, we're going to see everyone as our adversary. And collectively, we're going to see other nations as our adversaries, and we're going to react at the first provocation. And undoubtedly, we're going to end up in a nuclear war, and that'll be the end of life on Earth. However, if we can answer this question, choose to answer the question, is the universe a friendly place? We're more likely to treat people as potential partners, and we're more likely to cooperate. So he thought this was the underlying question. So in other words, this goes to a negotiation technique, which is one of the greatest powers we have is the ability to reframe. Take the same situation and see it in different ways. You could frame the situation as friendly, life is basically on your side, or you can frame it as unfriendly, and that's basically our choice. That's basically our choice. And how we do that, after all, that depending on how we make that decision, affects a lot of things for us. If I might just use, for example, we could, reframe the picture as scarcity. There's just, life is scarce, and so I'm going to just grab mine. Or we can approach a situation from a frame of sufficiency. Maybe there's enough for both of us or for all of us, and the way in which we frame that, the underlying mindset, the underlying assumptions we bring to that situation will affect those things. So these are some of the ways in which we can do this, but you can ask yourself, for example, this question is, where does my satisfaction come from? Is there enough? Can I see life on my side? In other words, just question our assumptions and see if some of our beliefs, in fact, are limiting beliefs. If I may just use an example from my own personal life, one of the better examples of this, where I can learn this from, is my own daughter, who's 16. Her name is Gabi, and she was born with a lot of medical difficulties. She's had like 15 major surgeries on different parts of her body, structural difficulties, and she always wanted to, but somehow she has a positive attitude about life. She frames things in a different way. She doesn't feel sorry for herself. She develops her own inner Batna, and one of her dreams from when she was little was she always wanted to be in the Guinness Book of World Records. And so when she was like 7 or 8, she tried to make the longest hopscotch course in the driveway, with crayon, and then a chalk. And then another one was she was going to try to put most socks on one foot. Anyway, a year ago, she announced that for her 16th birthday, she was going to try again, but this time she was going to do an exercise. Do you know the exercise called the plank? Does anyone know what the plank is? It's kind of a abdominal exercise where you lie down and you put your elbows down and you hold your body straight for hours long. I don't know how long you can do it, but I can do it for about a minute, maybe 2. Anyway, Gabi wrote away to the Guinness Book of World Records, and it turned out the women-female record was 40 minutes. But she went into training, and when her birthday came by, she was going to do it at her birthday party, actually, try to break this. And we had to get a little video camera and whatever, just for if she did break it, to be able to set it in the Guinness Book of World Records and have a certain number of witnesses and so on. And she, believe it or not, she went for 1 hour and 20 minutes. And she's now in the 2015 Book of Guinness World Records. So I'm just saying it's just an example of someone who's able to, not just take her circumstances for, whatever, but just to reframe that ability to by getting to yes with herself, then, she was able to get to yes with others. So I can go there in my book. There's a whole set of steps. I've gone over a few of them. Put yourself in your shoes, develop your inner Batna, reframe your picture, which then allows you to stay in the zone, which is the place of peak performance, the place of flow, which athletes know and artists know. And the question is, can we apply that in our own daily situations, our own conflicts and negotiations, the place of highest satisfaction and performance, which also then allows us, because we've taken care of our own psychological needs, to be able to respect people, even if at first they don't respect us. Which turns out to be key, because so often I find in conflict situations what happens is the other side rejects us, so we reject them back, and then they reject us back, and we're going to get locked into it. Someone has to break that cycle. But it could be us, but it can only be us if we are drawing on our own self-respect, if we're drawing our own nourishment, which then allows us to give and receive and to get into a more cooperative mode. So what I've found here is there's a whole set of steps that are kind of inner homework that allow us to get to yes much more easily with others. Starting with an inner yes, it produces an outer yes. And effectively what this does is it provides with 3 wins, 3 victories in the end. One is a victory inside of ourselves, which is greater satisfaction. And the other is a win-win. We're able much more likely to reach mutually acceptable and satisfactory agreements with others. But ultimately, it also brings a win-win-win, which is where it induces a more generous, a more compassionate perspective that allows us to help the larger whole, whether it's the family, the workplace, or the world. So let me just end this talk and take some questions, but with one last story. I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. I'm just headed there actually in a few weeks. I have a project that we use Google Maps for, of developing kind of an out-of-the-box innovative idea of a long-distance walking trail across the Middle East that retraces the footsteps of Abraham, and it goes, and it's to kind of just bring people together. You walk and you stay in people's homes, and it's developing. We have about 1,000 kilometers called Abraham Path. We have a website, and we use Google Earth, and Google AdWords has been very kind to us. But anyway, one of my favorite negotiating stories that comes from the Middle East is a story about 3 brothers who receive an inheritance from their father of 17 camels. And the older son receives half the camels. The middle son receives 1/3 of the camels. And the youngest son, he receives 1/9 of the camels. Well, 3 sons fall to dividing up their inheritance, but 17 doesn't divide by 2, and it doesn't divide by 3, and it doesn't divide by 9. So they get into a bit of a quarrel, and each one wants more, and brotherly tempers start to get strained, and they're almost violence. Finally, in desperation, they go and they consult a wise old woman, and the wise old woman, like a good boss, thinks about the problem and says, well, I don't have an answer, but if you want, let me empower you. You can have my camel. I have 1 camel. So the 3 sons say, okay. So then they have 18 camels. Well, 18 does divide by 2, so the first son takes his half. Half of 18 is 9. 18 does divide by 3. The second son takes his 1/3, which is 6. 18 does divide by 9. The third son takes his 9th, which is 2. You add 9 and 6, 15, plus 2, 17. They have 1 camel left over. They give it back to the wise old woman. Now, if you think about that problem for a moment, I think it resembles a little bit the negotiations that we often get involved in. It seems to be, 17 camels, no way to divide it up. Somehow what we need to do is to learn to take a step back to the balcony, change our assumptions, and look for an 18th camel. And my suggestion is that 18th camel might in fact be ourselves. If we can get to yes with ourselves, we're much more likely to get to yes with others. Thank you very much. So we have some time for some questions about anything in this field of negotiation, getting to yes.
You talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but how you see over your career with negotiations, how do you see the internet and technology and even Google and Facebook changing what you do and changing how negotiations happen? Mm-hmm. Like you talked about how the hierarchy was flattening into a graph, and so there's more negotiations. But you see people, like, to me, it seems like you see a lot of people going out and broadcasting on social media and trying to stake out their own positions and making it harder to negotiate, maybe.
For sure. It cuts in a lot of different ways, but one thing is very clear. It's changing the framework, because a lot of people are taking their negotiations online in many ways. And in terms of conflicts like that, you see, it's partly the internet, it's partly, cable TV and so on, but you see segmenting where people are only talking to people who agree with them instead of, and you see a lot of inflammatory kind of use of inflammatory rhetoric that goes online, and that has, before wasn't broadcast. Or you see, for example, right now you see like ISIS has gotten very social media savvy. They're doing these horrific beheadings with social media and using that. So I think we're in this first generation of figuring out how do we deal with our differences given this whole new way of communicating. And we're in this mix too, but I think the form of decision-making shifting, but what's also happening, I see, is that nowadays, everyone wants to participate in decisions that affect them, much more than people are not nearly as passive as they were before. Just saying, okay, let the leader decide. No, everyone wants to have a voice, and you're starting to show this up in social media. So, in a funny way, this negotiation revolution means, at least in the short run, a lot more conflict, because a lot of conflict that was suppressed and avoided before, injustices that were never addressed, are now coming to the surface. And so it's actually, to me, in the field of conflict resolution, I see that the task of facing humanity right now is not so much how we can't settle all these conflicts. The question is, can we transform the conflicts? Can we change their form from a violent and destructive form, even violent in terms of words like you're talking about, to can we learn to more constructive and cooperative language, even as we carry on a struggle? Because maybe the world we need, with all the injustice in the world, we maybe need conflict actually to engage it. But can we learn to do that in an engaging way? And what I found, like 35 years ago, when I started in this field, there were no courses on negotiation. Now, there's every business school, law school, school government, corporations, Google, you have courses. But I think we're in the infancy of learning, and what I would love to see is the kind of creativity and the genius that goes on here at Google into kind of better forms of software and everything, but used on the software of human relationships and used on the software of how we deal with our differences. And to me, that's the great challenge. And I would love to see the mix of looking for the best kind of new methods, new processes married together with technology, and see what that would do. Because I'm an optimist. I happen to believe or at least I'm a potentialist. I really think that human beings have the potential, but I think the jury's still out. We've got this technology that's being used for weapons. Can we take the same technology and use it for, as you are using it, for better forms of communication?
I had a question about just different kind of thoughts or voices that you might have going on inside, right? So with kind of the balcony view, you get to really kind of take a perspective, take a step back. But then, do you have any personal stories on your journey to developing that balcony and really being able to figure out which voice inside your head to say yes to, and developing that awareness for which ones to say yes to, right?
Yeah, a really good question. Yeah, I mean, this is something, I was just talking with Meng about this, but for me, yeah, it began with, everyone has their favorite ways of going to the balcony. Some people, meditation, for example, is a wonderful time-honored old practice. And for me personally, one thing I love to do is, you have the advantage here of using nature. What I like to do is I like to go for walks, and just to kind of clear my mind. Like, for example, when I was in Venezuela. So everyone, you need to look for what methodologies work for you. For me, I was looking for ways that kind of change the rhythm of my brain a little bit, just kind of put myself into a more of a calm state so that I could clear. And then what I learned was just a simple rule of thumb of, for example, that helped me was don't make an important decision at the table. In other words, when someone's asking you, okay, what's your bottom line? What's this? Just say, let me get back to you. I'll get back to you this afternoon. I'll get back to you in an hour. I'll get back to you tomorrow morning. But making sure that just what that did was it allowed me then to go to a balcony and try to go to a place of clarity so that I could listen, because I find that the mind's a little bit like, it's like, water that comes out of a tap. There's a lot of fizz in it. And if you can just put it aside for 5 minutes, the fizz clears and you can clarify it. So that I've sort of learned to do that. And I think everyone will have their own method for doing that, of how you can kind of clarify, but just buying time, buying a little bit of time. And I know that in today's day and age, we're being asked to make quicker decisions, quicker, things partly due to the internet. The response rate. It used to be write a letter. It took 2 weeks to get back a letter. Now people want an answer in an hour because they just sent you a text or an email. But to me, the motto is, in a fast age like this, there's a paradox, which is if you want to go fast, you need to go slow. There's this paradox of looking for ways to slow it down, even if it's just a few seconds or a few minutes. Breathing, for example, as a technique, it just brings more oxygen to your brain. It's just kind of like take a couple deep breaths and just be careful about making decisions right on the spot. And that's been helpful to me. And then the other thing I'll say too is that I'm amazed at how, if I do that, it's like a muscle. You develop more and more, but you get clarity about which voice to listen to. It becomes clear. And then if I can't do that, sometimes you can use a friend. You can use a friend as your balcony, or a couple of friends, because sometimes we're blind to our own blind spots, but the friends can see them more easily.
Thank you for being here. Quick question about cultural differences to people negotiating. So in your experience, you've seen a lot of different types of cultures negotiate. Do you think there's one universal way that people are wired to negotiate, or do you think there are true cultural differences to how people negotiate?
Well, I think I'm an anthropologist by training, so I have a little bias here, I'll have to say, but I do think there are strong cultural differences. And that's not to say that there are some universal principles or some universal, so there's maybe a kind of an understructure of universality, but then the way in which those get manifested, very different in cultures, because cultures are like communication, they're like languages. And so they're just different ways of communicating, but there are a lot of assumptions that are embedded in cultures, like, for example, around time. American culture is one of the most impatient cultures on the planet, right? But if you go to other cultures around the world, for us, time is money. That's the expression here. Time is money. In most other places, time is relationship. And we want to go there and do a quick deal, and they're saying, "Whoa, hold on for a moment. We haven't established a relationship that builds the necessary trust." Or, for example, what's the nature of an agreement? We have a highly legalized culture, right? There are more lawyers, say, in the city of Los Angeles than there are in the whole country of Japan. Because we're used to saying, okay, we're going to have a legal culture, and if you don't keep your contract, we're going to sue you, and we've got this whole thing. In many other cultures, they don't depend on the courts for that. What they depend on is having built long-term relationships. So that's the way in which they achieve compliance. And so culture is, one last thing I'll say about culture, because it go on for a while, is I had a friend, a colleague, who was one of the first anthropologists to really look at cross-cultural communication. His name was Edward Hall. And he coined a distinction I find very useful, which is, he said, cultures are like communication systems, and he defined it like a continuum from what he called low context communication to high context communication. In low context communication, the content is pretty much all you need to see. In high context communication, you get the content, but if you don't understand the context, you don't understand anything. So like a classic example of high context culture would be, like, say, in East Asia, like say Japan, for example. One classic negotiation in Japan historically was when the shogun, who was the military dictator of Japan a couple centuries ago, when he ceded power to the emperor, what did he do? He paid a visit to the emperor, they had some tea together, and then he went away. No, there was no signed agreement, I'm handing over power or anything like that, but it was very clear to everyone in Japan what had just happened, because he went to the emperor didn't go to him, and they understood the context. And so, but the US is a lower context culture. So that, for example, we'll send, for example, Google or whatever, you'll send someone down to, say, Latin America, which is a higher context culture. And you'll send someone who is the most capable, the one who knows the most knowledge, right? It's got all the facts and everything like that. But they may be 22 or 25. And they show up in Latin America and they say, wait a minute, they just sent us a kid, because for them, the social context of, wait a minute, who is this person in relation to who and whatever, are we supposed to trust this person? So they may not put as much emphasis on the content as we do in this culture. And so understanding those differences is really very important.
Having said that, thank you very much for speaking with us today. We'll do a book signing in the back, and you can check out his book on Google Play and wherever books are sold.
Great. And thank you. May you get to yes with yourself and with others. And if more information about me, if you ever want to contact me or whatever, there's my information. But it's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I'm happy to sign a few books if